At 06:15 on the morning of July 3rd in the year 1942, Corporal Alfie Nichols sat inside the gunner's seat of his Crusader tank on the long ridge of Ruse, at watching a wide cloud of brown dust lifting 8 miles to the west as German armor rolled toward them across the hard Egyptian desert. Alfie was 24 years old, and he had spent almost a full year in North Africa, yet he had never destroyed a single enemy tank. The force coming toward them belonged to the 15th and the 21st Panzer Divisions, with roughly 60 tanks pushing straight for the ridge, where Nichols and the worn-down survivors of the 2nd Armored Brigade waited in their thin Crusader machines. The British Army called the Crusader a cruiser tank, fast and light and completely outmatched by German guns. Its 2-pounder weapon could barely harm a Panzer III, except at close distance, and against a Panzer IV it was almost pointless. The heaviest armor on the turret face was 49mm, which meant German 75mm shells cut through it like paper. Crews had given the Crusader a name that stuck: Tin Can. By the first days of July, the 2nd Armored Brigade had lost 87 tanks during the long retreat from Gazala. The 9th Lancers had only a handful of working vehicles left. 13 crews had been killed in the previous 3 weeks, and 21 more had been wounded badly enough to be taken out of the line. Egypt itself felt like it was hanging over an open pit. The city of Alexandria lay 70 miles to the east with the Suez Canal beyond. If the enemy reached Ruse, at Ridge nothing stood between the Afrika Korps and Cairo. Alfie had grown up in the quiet green countryside of England, the son of a farm labourer. Before the war, people knew him as a poacher because he was an expert shot with a rifle, and he had endless patience in the woods and fields. He could take home a full bag of pheasants or rabbits after a single night of hunting. At first, those skills translated poorly inside a tank. He missed targets, he wasted shells. His commander even thought about sending him to the infantry, but something changed during the retreat from Gazala. Nichols stopped thinking like a rifleman and began thinking like a hunter again. He learned how to read the shape of the ground through the cracked periscope, how to sense when an enemy tank would pause even for 2 or 3 seconds, how to wait for a moment that others rushed past. His accuracy improved slowly at first, then sharply. Still, the chaos at Gazala left no space for miracles. But his crew began to trust him because they sensed that when a shot mattered, Alfie Nichols could place it. The German tanks reached them at dawn. Alfie counted 18 Panzers in the first line. Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs mixed together, rolling in a loose pattern toward the western shoulder of the ridge. British 25-pounder guns opened up first, throwing bursts of fire into the German formation. The Panzers kept coming. They always came on. At 600 yards, the German tanks began firing at the forward British posts. Through his narrow sight, Alfie watched a Crusader from C Squadron take a direct hit. The tank erupted at once, the whole turret turning into a furnace. 2 men climbed out in flames. The loader never made it. Alfie had shared cigarettes with that man the night before. The order for Crusader crews was always the same: hold fire until close range. The 2-pounder could not pierce the front armor of a Panzer from more than 300 yards. That meant the British had to sit still while the enemy fired again and again. It meant crews watched their friends die before they were allowed to shoot back. Alfie heard his commander over the intercom telling him to wait. 400 yards, still too far. 350, 300. A Panzer IV turned its turret straight toward their position, and Alfie saw the long barrel of the 75 swing into place like a finger pointing at him through the dust. The German tank fired, the round missed by 6 feet. The blast shook the Crusader like a hand slapping an empty tin. Over the intercom, the commander spoke again. Fire when ready. Alfie breathed slowly and placed the crosshair on the turret ring of the Panzer IV, the weakest spot on the tank. He waited for the German machine to settle for 2 heartbeats. Then he pulled the trigger. The 2-pounder shell slammed into the joint between the turret and the hull, and the enemy tank froze. Smoke poured from the open hatch. Alfie did not stare. He was already hunting the next target. A Panzer III roughly 320 yards away, moving left to right across his line of fire. The battle had begun for real, and Alfie Nichols felt the old instincts rise inside him, as steady as breath in the cold hours before dawn. The Panzer III continued rolling toward a small group of British anti-tank guns set up on the western slope of the ridge, and Alfie tracked the movement through his narrow sight, waiting for the instant when the German tank would lose momentum. The vehicle jolted as it crossed a patch of rough ground and slowed for a brief moment. Alfie fired. The shot pierced the thinner side armor, and the Panzer lurched to a halt with its right track torn apart. 2 kills in little more than a minute and a half. His loader was already shoving another round into the hot breach, while the commander called out new bearings, and the driver reversed the Crusader into the shadow of a low, rocky rise. British tank doctrine demanded movement after every shot. Fire, then relocate. Anything else meant death. All across the length of Ruse. At Ridge, the fighting widened like a storm stretching over sand. German artillery began striking the ridge with heavy blasts. High explosive shells erupted around the scattered Crusaders, lifting fountains of sand and broken stone into the air. Alfie watched another Crusader from B Squadron take a direct impact. The thin armor on the top of the British tank offered almost no protection. The vehicle blew apart in a single violent pulse. Meanwhile, the Panzers were still pushing forward, trying to break through the ridge and reach the empty desert beyond. If they reached that open ground, they could swing north and cut the supply line of the entire 8th Army. The few British tanks en route had stood as the last barrier. Alfie's crew shifted their Crusader again, finding a new position where he could see the western approach with clearer visibility. He counted 11 German tanks still driving forward. The Panzers were no longer packed tightly. They were spreading out to make themselves harder targets for the British guns. It was sound strategy, but the widened formation slowed their advance, giving Alfie more time to observe and aim. A Panzer III emerged in his sight at 280 yards. The German tank had come to a stop, its commander likely scanning the ridge. Alfie aimed at the center of the turret face and fired without hesitation. The round penetrated and the hatch blew open as the crew scrambled out. 3 kills. The time was 07:30, and the battle had already lasted more than 1 hour. British anti-tank crews were taking a heavy toll on the approaching Panzers. Although the 2-pounder guns were outdated and weak at distance, they were deadly when the enemy came close. Alfie saw a British gun crew about 200 yards to his left engage a Panzer IV at near point-blank range. They fired 3 quick shots and all 3 hit true. The German tank burst into flames, but the exchange rate was brutal. For every German machine destroyed, 2 or 3 British guns were lost to return fire. The ridge was turning into a graveyard of steel. Burning vehicles, British and German alike, covered the western slope, and their thick smoke curled into the bright morning sky. Alfie's Crusader moved again. The driver found a shallow rise that offered some cover from artillery, while still allowing a full view of the enemy approach. Alfie scanned through the sight. He saw a Panzer IV moving toward them at 400 yards. Too far for certainty, he waited. 350, 300. The Panzer halted to fire at a British machine. Alfie aimed carefully at the hull side, where the armor was weaker. He squeezed the trigger. The shell struck, and the Panzer groaned to a stop with smoke rising from the engine plate. 4 kills. By 0800, he had fired 17 rounds with 4 confirmed kills and 3 more likely but unverified. The others had missed or failed to penetrate. His loader worked with blistered hands while the heat inside the turret mixed with thick cords of smoke and sweat. Yet the Germans kept pushing forward. At 0820, the attack reached its height. Alfie counted 9 Panzers advancing in a straight coordinated line meant to overwhelm the remaining British positions with sheer weight of fire. The 15th Panzer Division was pressing hard because they understood what Ruse had meant. Control the ridge and control Egypt. lose the ridge and the desert war might slip away, Alfie steadied himself as the German line advanced once more toward the battered British front. The Crusader engine rumbled below him, the barrel trembled with heat, and his breath felt raw in the stifling air. The morning had become a contest between patience, skill, and pure survival, and Alfie Nichols knew that every shot he fired now mattered more than anything else he had done in his life. The fate of the ridge decided the fate of Egypt and everyone en route, and knew it as the battle pushed into its third hour with the sun rising higher and the heat tightening around every man in steel. Alfie and his crew had been fighting without pause, the Crusader engine groaning from strain, and the radio filled with broken voices reporting the destruction of British tanks all along the line. C Squadron had already lost 4 more machines in the last 30 minutes, and a squadron had only 3 vehicles still functioning. The 9th Lancers were being cut down piece by piece, yet they were taking German tanks with them. Alfie saw a 2-pounder gun crew to the north engage a Panzer III at 150 yards. Their first shot buried itself in the sand, but the second hit the front plate, and the German tank stopped dead. The crew barely had time to register the kill before a German high-explosive round crashed into their position and erased the gun and every man around it in a single violent pulse. Alfie shut the image out of his mind because he could not afford to carry anything except the next target. Another Panzer IV was rolling toward his position at 300 yards, firing while moving and throwing bursts of dirt over the ridge. Alfie waited. German tanks often fired on the move, but they always paused to take a proper aim. The Panzer slowed and stopped. Alfie fired. The shot punched through the turret side. 5 kills. The time was 08:35. Alfie had now been locked in combat for more than 2 hours. His commander ordered the driver to shift position. The Crusader slid backward, then crawled 300 yards east along the ridge to a new angle on the approaching Germans. From here, Alfie could see the smoke of burning tanks rising across the desert floor. More than 20 vehicles were burning. He could not tell which belonged to the British and which belonged to the Germans. They were only shapes of fire and twisted metal marking the ground. A Panzer III appeared at 260 yards. The tank was still as if the commander was trying to signal or coordinate. Alfie aimed low at the hull side below the turret ring. He fired. The shell punched through and flames began licking at the engine. 6 kills, the pattern repeated over and over. German armor advanced. British guns answered. Vehicles burned. Men died. No side gave an inch because both understood the stakes. For the Germans, the ridge was a doorway into the heart of Egypt. For the British, the ridge was the last wall stopping the collapse of their entire defense. At 0900, the crew counted only 12 rounds remaining in the ready rack. In a normal clash, that would be enough, but this was not normal. The Germans were still coming with no sign of slowing. Alfie fired again at a Panzer IV at 310 yards and hit. 7 kills. Another Panzer III moved in at 240 yards. Alfie fired and hit. 8 kills. The loader called out that they had 8 rounds left, then 6, then 4, as they continued firing and repositioning. Each shot felt heavier than the last. At 0925, Alfie spotted a Panzer III moving into position at 400 yards. A long shot for a 2-pounder, yet the German tank was perfectly outlined by the morning sun, as if offering itself to him. Alfie adjusted for distance and drop, then watched the Panzer stop to fire at a British position. He fired, the round smashed into the turret face at an angle, then triggered the ammunition inside. The turret lifted into the air and crashed down. 9 kills in a single morning, something unheard of among British tank gunners using a weapon that most believed was almost useless against German armor. Alfie leaned back from the scope, with his hands shaking not from fear, but from exhaustion and the violent pulse of adrenaline that had carried him through the morning. He had achieved something no one else on the ridge had come close to. Yet the battle was not finished, and they still had 3 shells left. At 0940, the German attack finally began to falter. The 15 Panzer Division had lost too many tanks. Their unified push fractured into separate scattered movements. Some panzers reversed westward, trailing black smoke. Others sat crippled in the sand with their crews fleeing on foot. Alfie watched them through his sight, breathing hard in the sweltering turret, as he waited for the next order, knowing the ridge was still on a knife edge, and the slightest shift could still send everything into collapse. The 15 Panzer Division had finally lost too much strength, and the mighty push that had stormed toward the ridge all morning was breaking apart into scattered movements, with some tanks trying to fall back, while others sat crippled and silent in the sand, and still others attempted to regroup, but lacked the numbers to make a fresh charge. Orders came through the radio for Alfie and his crew. Hold position. Save every remaining shell. The Crusaders settled deeper behind the rocky outcrop in a shallow hole-down stance that hid most of the tank beneath the ridgeline, while still giving Alfie a full window over the western sector. The battlefield below looked like a vast graveyard shaped by fire. Burned-out Crusaders lay with their turrets torn open. German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs smoked from hits that had struck their engines or ammunition racks. The bodies of abandoned anti-tank guns stood half-buried in sand with broken wheels and shattered shields. The rising sun stretched long dark shadows across the wreckage, giving the entire ridge the appearance of a battlefield frozen in a photograph, yet the air still shook with the distant thump of British artillery. The 25-pounders were now targeting areas to the west where the remaining German armor had attempted to regroup. Explosions bloomed across the desert plain, sending up new bursts of black fire. Alfie watched a damaged Panzer IV take a direct artillery strike and disintegrate. Though the kill did not belong to him, it still meant one less threat to Egypt. At 1,000 hours, new reports reached the brigade. The ridge was still in British hands. The German assault had been stopped. The cost on both sides had been severe, yet the line remained unbroken. Alfie felt the tension ease only slightly as his loader counted the remaining shells. 3 rounds left. They had begun the morning with 52. Alfie had fired 49, 9 tanks destroyed with certainty, others possibly damaged or crippled. In tank warfare, even the finest gunners missed often, but today his shots had found their marks again and again. Yet the crew did not relax because Rammel's reputation hovered over them like a weight. The German commander seldom gave up after a single failed attempt. If he believed he still had a chance, he would strike again. The Crusader received new orders to shift further east along the ridge. As the driver maneuvered the tank, Alfie finally saw the full sweep of the battlefield without the narrow frame of the gun sight. He counted at least 30 burning vehicles scattered across the sand. Thick smoke coiled upward until it formed massive black pillars that rose far above the desert floor and drifted for miles. The smell of burning fuel and rubber clung to everything. British recovery crews had already moved forward to salvage what they could. A Crusader that could be repaired would be repaired, even if it meant scavenging parts from 3 broken hulls. The 8th Army could not afford to lose machines unnecessarily. German tanks were stronger and more reliable. British victory depended partly on keeping as many working tanks in the field as possible. Alfie and his crew waited in their new position, every man silently watching the west in case the enemy gathered themselves for another attempt. They had seen the Germans retreat before only to launch a new attack with fierce determination. If Rammel's remaining tank commanders believed there was still a small opening, they would try again in the afternoon. The hours crawled by under the building heat. The air shimmered over the sand. The smell of cordite still clung inside the turret. Each man drank water in short, careful sips, knowing dehydration could strike harder than shrapnel. At 1100 hours, a new dust cloud appeared to the west. The crew tensed at once, believing the Germans had returned for another push, but as the shapes grew clearer through binoculars, they saw British tanks advancing in formation. The 22nd Armoured Brigade had arrived at last. Fresh crews, full ammunition, stronger numbers. Their arrival shifted the entire balance of the fight. Alfie's commander received new instructions. Withdraw from the front to the rear area for repairs and resupply. The Crusader turned east and rolled away from the ridge that had consumed their morning. Alfie looked back only once at the western slope. Burned metal stretched as far as he could see. German and British wrecks lay side by side without distinction, and the ground that had been contested so violently now stood covered in smoke and silence. He felt no triumph, only exhaustion, the deep, heavy exhaustion of a man who had done everything possible to survive. His hands still shook from the intensity of the morning. His eyes burned from hours locked behind the sight. Yet he had done something extraordinary without meaning to chase glory or medals. 9 tanks destroyed by a weapon most crews believed too weak to matter. He did not know that commanders across the 8th Army were already discussing his actions. He did not know that his name was being noted, forwarded, and underlined. All he knew was that he was thirsty, worn out, and grateful to still be alive in a tank that many called a tin can yet had carried him through one of the fiercest mornings of the Desert War. The Crusader rolled into the rear assembly area at 11:30, and for the first time in more than 5 hours, Alfie climbed out of the turret and let his boots touch the ground, and the moment he stood upright his legs almost failed beneath him, as if the battle had drained every thread of strength from his body. His uniform clung to him, soaked with sweat that had built up inside the tank since dawn, and the loader and driver looked equally worn with dust covering their faces, and fatigue carved into every line of their eyes. Their commander walked straight toward the squadron tent to file the official after-action report, because British tank doctrine demanded accurate records after every fight. Every shell fired, every target hit, every position taken or lost. All of it needed to be written down so the higher levels of command could understand exactly what had happened en route at Ridge. The commander had kept careful notes during the battle. 9 enemy tanks destroyed by Corporal Nichols in a single morning. No other gunner in the 2nd Armoured Brigade had come close to such a number. By noon, the report reached brigade headquarters, and from there it moved to divisional headquarters, where the unusual claim caught attention at once. 9 tanks destroyed in one engagement using a 2-pounder gun inside a Crusader tank. The numbers felt impossible. Either someone had exaggerated or something extraordinary had occurred on the ridge. Divisional intelligence began verifying the account. German radio traffic intercepted that morning mentioned heavy losses on the right flank of the 15th Panzer Division, precisely where the 9th Lancers had been positioned. Aerial photographs taken after the battle showed 9 German tanks destroyed in a cluster that matched the grid coordinates written in the Lancers' report. The evidence lined up with each detail. Alfie had truly done it. By 1400 hours, word reached the headquarters of the 8th Army, where General Bernard Montgomery had recently taken command, though the battle itself had taken place under his predecessor. Montgomery was reviewing every action from the previous weeks to understand what had given the army strength and what had nearly broken it during the desperate fighting that had decided the fate of Egypt. When he read the report concerning a young corporal who had destroyed 9 German tanks, he paused. His experience told him that small moments of unusual skill could shift the balance of wider battles, and the 8th Army needed every fragment of morale and confidence it could gather. He made a note to find this gunner and to congratulate him personally. Alfie knew nothing of this growing recognition. He spent the afternoon helping his crew tend to their Crusader. They checked the oil drained and refilled the engine bay, examined the tracks, tightened the suspension, and cleaned the 2-pounder gun until every last trace of cordite was gone. Combat punished machines as much as men, and a tank that was not cared for between engagements could fail during the next fight, and failure in battle usually meant death. At 1600 hours, an officer from brigade headquarters arrived and asked for Corporal Nichols. The loader pointed beneath the tank where Alfie was lying on a canvas sheet, checking the suspension rollers. Alfie rolled out covered in grease and dust, and the officer informed him that his actions from the morning were being examined at the highest command levels. Alfie felt confused because he believed he had only done what any gunner would do. He had fought for his life, fired when targets appeared, and tried to keep his crew alive. The officer explained that 9 confirmed tank kills in one morning had never been recorded before for a British gunner in North Africa. Command required details. Alfie listed the times, the distances, the types of panzers, and the places where each shot had struck. The officer noted everything, thanked him, and left. Alfie returned to the suspension without thinking about medals or honors or generals. His thoughts stayed on the next battle because the Afrika Korps was far from finished. Everyone knew Rommel's forces would soon gather for another attempt to break the British line, and when that day came, Alfie wanted the Crusader ready for the fight. Yet unseen by him, his name was already moving across desks and through headquarters. Commanders were discussing the impossible accuracy of a corporal who had taken on some of the toughest tanks in the desert using a weapon many believed useless. Reports were being copied and forwarded. Verification was complete. The story was spreading, but to Alfie Nichols it was just another day of war. The morning had been brutal, the afternoon was filled with the metallic smell of oil and sweat, and the evening would bring another night of restless sleep on the hard desert ground. Still, he worked quietly beside his crew, sharing the same determination that had carried them through the flames en route at Ridge. Survival came from discipline and unity, not from glory. Alfie did not yet know that a medal was already being prepared for him, or that a general would soon take his hand and speak his name. All he knew was that the desert war was far from over, and he would soon be back inside the turret of a tank. Many soldiers still called a tin can aiming again at the shapes that moved across the sand. Montgomery had already reached his decision even before all the paperwork was complete, because to him the story of a corporal inside a thin Crusader tank destroying 9 enemy machines in one morning spoke to the kind of determination he believed would turn the desert war around, and so preparations began for a military medal, while personal congratulations from the general himself were planned as soon as time allowed. Yet the Eighth Army could not pause to celebrate because Rommel was preparing one final great push that he hoped would break the British line once and for all and open the road to the Nile Delta. That blow came on August 30th during the battle known as Alam Hafa. The 9th Lancers were thrown into action again with their Crusaders positioned along the southern flank, waiting for the next wave of panzers. Alfie sat back inside the same familiar gunner seat, gripping the handles of the 2-pounder while the tank swayed across the uneven ground. The pattern of battle felt the same as before. German armor advancing across the open desert, British guns answering from prepared positions, artillery roaring, explosions pulsing across the horizon. Through all of it, Alfie remained steady and calm, letting instinct guide him as it had on Ruse, at Ridge. By the time the fighting ended on September 5th, Rommel had been stopped again. The Afrika Korps was running low on fuel. Their supply lines stretched across more than 1,000 miles of harsh desert from Tripoli, while British ships and aircraft struck their convoys again and again. The German offensive stalled, and Alfie added 2 more enemy tanks to his confirmed record. 1 Panzer III and 1 Panzer IV, both taken at close distance with the same patient timing that had made him so effective before. His total now stood at 11 kills acknowledged and verified. Some men in the regiment believed the true number was higher, but Alfie only counted what he could prove. In mid-September, the 9th Lancers were pulled from the line at last. They were told new equipment was arriving. It came in the form of American-built Sherman tanks. For the first time, the crews felt they had a machine that could match German armor on equal ground. The Sherman carried a 75mm gun capable of punching into enemy tanks at far greater range than the 2-pounder. Armor protection was better and the engine far more dependable. Still, the gun worked differently, and Alfie had to relearn everything about range and drop and timing. Many of the habits he had built inside the Crusader no longer applied. But the patience remained, and patience mattered more than anything else in the life of a gunner. Good gunners adapted, and Alfie adapted quickly. On October 15th, in the year 1942, Alfie received orders to report to the headquarters of the 8th Army. When he arrived, he found several other soldiers standing in line, all waiting to be recognized for outstanding performance in recent battles. At 1400 hours, General Montgomery stepped into the room. He walked down the line, speaking a few words to each man, but when he reached Alfie, he paused longer. Montgomery knew the details of the young corporal from the 9th Lancers, who had destroyed 9 enemy tanks on July 3rd at Rousat Ridge. He shook Alfie's hand and told him plainly that the 8th Army needed men like him, men who could take weaker equipment and still defeat the enemy through grit and skill. The entire meeting lasted little more than a minute, but its weight settled into Alfie in a way he did not expect. A general had crossed a room to speak to a corporal because of what had taken place on a ridge of burning sand. The regiment heard of it quickly. News traveled faster than any motorbike. Men began calling Alfie the best gunner in the brigade, though he never let such words change how he worked. Reputation meant nothing in the turret of a moving tank. Pride got crews killed. Consistency kept them alive. Identify the target, judge the range, wait for the stillness, fire, nothing more. Not long after the meeting, the military medal was officially approved. The citation specifically honored the 9 kills on July 3rd, and Alfie received the medal in a small ceremony at regimental headquarters. He pinned it to his uniform, then went straight back to training on the Sherman because the war did not pause for medals. The Second Battle of El Alamein was approaching, scheduled to begin on October 23rd. This battle would decide more than a ridge or a valley. It would decide the future of the entire North African campaign. Montgomery planned it with absolute precision. A massive artillery barrage to break the enemy line, infantry pushing forward to clear the minefields, armor breaking through the gap to drive the enemy into retreat. The 8th Army had more men, more guns, and more tanks than ever before. This time Rommel would not slip away. The night before the opening barrage, Alfie inspected his Sherman's 75mm gun one last time, making sure the sights were set, and the ammunition stored correctly along the sponsons, even though he knew those same sponsons could become deadly if struck. The desert wind carried dust across the camp. The air hummed with the anticipation of a battle that would echo through history. Alfie sat quietly inside the turret, letting his breath settle, waiting for the moment when the sky would crack open with the fire of 900 British guns. The moment the clocks touched 21:40 on October 23rd, the night exploded into a wall of thunder as 900 British guns opened fire at once, and the ground beneath the tanks shook like a living thing as shells screamed over the desert and tore into the German line with a force that rolled across the sand for miles in every direction. The barrage lasted 20 long minutes, and when it finally eased, the British infantry moved forward into the shattered minefields, clearing narrow paths by hand under the dim light of the moon, while German and Italian defenders fired desperately from dug positions that stretched deep across the front. Alfie and the 9th Lancers remained still inside their Shermans, listening to the echo of each detonation roll through the hull, because Montgomery's plan demanded that the armor wait until the infantry had opened lanes through the deadly web of mines before moving. The hours that followed felt endless. Reports came through the radio describing heavy casualties among the infantry as they fought through layered defenses. Minefields seemed to stretch forever, and each step forward cost blood. By October 26th, the breakthrough still had not succeeded. German positions held firm. Italian troops fought tenaciously. Despite the roaring guns and the constant advance, the enemy line bent but did not break. Montgomery responded by shifting the axis of assault, concentrating fire and manpower into a narrower front that he believed could be forced open by sheer weight. The 9th Lancers moved into new positions, prepared for the next phase. On November 2nd, the final assault began under the name Operation Supercharge. The Shermans advanced through the cleared lanes, their engines growling, and their treads grinding over broken ground as the sun rose over the battlefield. Alfie settled into his seat, gripping the gun controls and feeling the weight of the moment settle across his shoulders. Ahead of them lay the open desert, and with it the German armor waiting to meet them. The fighting that followed was unlike the brutal close-range brawls he had known in the Crusader. The 75mm gun changed the nature of combat entirely. Now Alfie could engage panzers at 600 yards with real hope of piercing them. Range that had once meant helplessness now meant advantage. Still, German gunners adapted quickly. They targeted the weak points of the Shermans, the hull sides, the turret ring, the ammunition stored inside the sponsons. When a shell struck, the sponsons' flames often erupted instantly, which led British crews to call the Sherman a Ronson because once hit it lit like a lighter. Alfie saw more than one tank erupt into a pillar of fire as ammunition brewed up inside. He fought without hesitation. Identify target, breathe, fire, the rhythm he had sworn never to abandon. During the push he added 3 confirmed kills, 2 Panzer IVs and an Italian medium tank. He did not celebrate. There was no time. The sand shook with explosions. Vehicles burned. Smoke hid the horizon until sky and ground looked fused together in a haze of black and grey. The only thing that mattered was survival and keeping his crew alive. By November 4th, the Afrika Korps could no longer hold, their line disintegrated, their remaining tanks retreated westward in a long desperate column, chased by British armour and struck from above by the relentless Desert Air Force. El Alamein had broken the German position at last and marked the turning point of the entire North African War. The 9th Lancers joined the pursuit across Libya, following the retreating enemy through miles upon miles of harsh terrain. They pushed past Tobruk and Benghazi and deep into the west as German strength dwindled, and their supply lines collapsed entirely. The war dragged on through the winter and into the spring until May in the year 1943, when the last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered and more than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms. Alfie and his crew had survived everything from ruse, at Ridge to the long chase across the desert. Luck, skill, teamwork, and the thin edge between life and death had carried them through battles that destroyed entire regiments. In mid-1944, the 9th Lancers were shipped to Italy, where the terrain changed completely. The wide open deserts were replaced with mountains, steep valleys, and narrow roads where tanks became easy targets for ambushes, and close-range fighting returned with even greater ferocity. The Sherman, that had been a powerful ally in the desert, became a burden in the tight stone paths of Italy. Yet Alfie fought on through the Gothic line, the crossing of the Savio River, and the slow, painful push into the Po Valley in the spring of 1945. His confirmed kill record climbed, but exact numbers from the Italian campaign were never written with certainty. Some in the regiment claimed he destroyed more than 40 enemy tanks in total, while others insisted the verified count remained closer to 13. The truth mattered less than the fact that he never failed his crew. On May 2, 1945, the German forces in Italy surrendered, and 6 days later the war in Europe ended. Alfie had survived 5 brutal years of combat, from the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of Italy, using 2 different tanks against some of the most skilled enemy forces in history. The regiment was demobilized later that year, and Alfie returned home to the quiet countryside of England, where the boy who once hunted pheasants became a man who had hunted tanks yet spoke little of it. The skills he had used to bring down 9 German machines on one extraordinary morning became the same steady hands he used to hunt legally for rabbits and pheasants for the family table. He married. He raised children. He lived a quiet life far from the dunes and minefields that had tried to claim him. The regiment recorded his achievement officially: 9 confirmed kills on July 3, 1942, a record unmatched across the entire North African campaign. But to Alfie, the only thing that mattered was that his crew had lived, others had not. He remembered them always. The war in Europe ended, and Alfie Nichols stepped away from the battlefield for the first time in 5 long years. Yet the echoes of everything he had lived through never left him as he returned to the English countryside, where his life had begun among quiet fields and hedgerows far removed from the deserts of Egypt and Libya and the mountains of Italy. The Sherman that had carried him through the Italian campaign finally rested, and so did the Crusader that had once been his thin metal shield en route at Ridge. The regiment he had served with the 9th Lancers was demobilized in late 1945, and the men who survived scattered back across Britain, carrying memories heavier than any medal pinned to their chest. Alfie slipped easily into the simple rhythms of rural life, because the land asked nothing of him, except patience and work, and both qualities had already shaped him long before the war. As a young man, he had been known for slipping through moonlit fields with steady hands and sharp eyes, able to strike a rabbit cleanly, or bring down a pheasant with calm precision. Those early skills had carried him into the turret of a tank and kept him alive when noise, fire, sand, and steel had swallowed the desert. Now those same steady hands returned to hunting not for secrecy or survival, but for quiet days spent providing food for a family that had waited for him to come home. He married, he raised children, he built a life built from gentleness rather than destruction. Yet the war lived inside him all the same. Neighbors knew he had served in North Africa and Italy. Some had heard he earned a military medal. Very few knew the details of what he had done on July 3rd in the year 1942, when the rising sun over Egypt cast long shadows across Ruz. At Ridge, and a young corporal inside a thin Crusader tank fought for his life against one of the strongest armored forces in the world. Alfie rarely spoke about that morning because men of his generation carried their past quietly. They believed the dead deserved silence and the living deserved peace, but the regiment did not forget. When the 9th Lancers later joined with the 12th Royal Lancers in 1960 to form a single unit, their combined history preserved the accounts of both regiments, and within those pages the name of Corporal Alfie Nichols appeared beside a record no other British gunner achieved during the entire North African campaign. 9 confirmed enemy tanks destroyed in one engagement, a feat made even more extraordinary by the reality of the Crusader itself. A tank that crews nicknamed Tin Can because it burned easily broke down often and could barely withstand the firepower of a Panzer IV. Yet Alfie had taken that fragile machine and used it with the calm skill of a hunter who waited for the perfect moment to fire. Men who met him in later years described him as modest and quiet, with a steady gaze that suggested he had seen more than he ever felt the need to explain. He did not consider himself a hero. He did not treat his medal as a treasure. To him, heroism belonged to the loaders who never made it out of burning hulls, or the crews who had been lost during the retreat from Gazala, or the men who fought beside him at Alam Hafa and El Alamein, and in the long pursuit across Libya into Tunisia. Their faces remained with him long after their names faded from the public memory. He carried them quietly as years turned to decades. He also carried the memory of the one morning when he and his crew faced a wave of German armor that should have crushed them yet somehow did not. He remembered the Crusader shaking under each impact, the sight picture trembling inside the scope, the smell of burning fuel, the cries over the radio, the moment the Panzer IV missed by inches the sudden flame from a British gun crew, wiped out by a high explosive round, and the impossible calm that settled inside his bones each time he pressed the trigger. That morning shaped his place in history, even though he never sought such a place. When he passed away many years after the war, the obituary written for him mentioned his service with the 9th Lancers, his military medal, and his role in the North African and Italian campaigns. But it did not describe the 9 burning tanks en route at Ridge. It did not describe the breath he held before each shot, or the patience that made him deadly, or the improbable survival of his crew through some of the harshest battles in the desert. Those details remained mostly in the hands of military historians and the few surviving veterans who remembered the ridge, the heat, the fear, and the young corporal who had turned a supposedly useless gun into a weapon that changed the course of a morning that might have changed the course of Egypt. Alfie spent the rest of his life in quiet work far from the sound of artillery and the sight of armored columns stretching across sand. Yet the story of that morning did not disappear entirely. It lived on in regimental records and in the memories of those who understood what it meant for a single gunner to stand between a stalled British line and the might of the Afrika Korps. It lived on because the desert has a way of keeping its stories even when men choose not to speak them. And somewhere on a ridge in Egypt, where wind sweeps over old wrecks, half buried in the sand, the tale of a young corporal with a hunter's patience, and a 2-pounder gun still lingers like heat, rising from stone, reminding whoever hears it that courage does not always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly behind a gun sight, waits for the perfect moment, and fires once. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.